Something shifted today, quietly, without warning. Not a flare or explosion, but something stranger, more surgical. A blip, a ripple, a faint pulse in the data streams pouring back from the solar corridor. 1 frame, 2 frames, gone. But within those frames, something that should not be there. A shadow, inverted. A signature, echoed. And the moment you see it, you feel it. Like waking up to a room rearranged. Like finding the furniture not quite where you left it. Something has moved. You've heard the name by now. 3I Atlas. It was already unusual, hyperbolic, accelerating, spinning when it shouldn't, shedding material in a Fibonacci spiral no natural comet has ever mimicked. But this is different, because today, 3I Atlas didn't just act strange, it interacted with us, with something, and whatever it touched, it changed. The impossibility stack grows taller. It entered the sun's magnetic halo, and instead of destabilizing, it stabilized. It passed through a zone where ice should have evaporated, and instead, it recondensed. Sensors from the European Solar Orbiter picked up a harmonic pitch not explainable by plasma oscillation. Some are calling it a glitch. Others are whispering communication. But what if it wasn't a signal at all? What if it was a response? Let's suppose for a moment, just at the edge of imagination, that 3I Atlas is not a passive wanderer. Let's say it's part of something larger, an artifact, a node, a seed, one that wakes when watched, or waits until conditions are precisely right. And today, those conditions were met. Something responded to its presence, and now we are no longer alone in the dialogue. Myth echoes quietly here. Cultures once spoke of sky-bringers, of objects that arrived when the veil between worlds grew thin. From the Dogon's Sirius myths to Sumerian accounts of engineered descent, stories of watchers arriving in silence, never truly leaving. Tonight, we begin again. Something strange happened with 3I Atlas today, and the cosmos just blinked back. It began with silence, but not the kind that empties a room. This was an active silence, a presence pretending to be absence. In the cold data streams from Earth's solar observation platforms, a pattern broke. Not shattered, not erased, interrupted. The line of predictive solar motion had been flawless for years. Heliophysics so precise, you could forecast solar storms months ahead. But today, that rhythm cracked. A photonic disruption just west of the solar equator, less than 1/5 of a second, and at its heart, a returning ghost. 3I Atlas. You stare at the monitor as if the shape might blink again. It doesn't, but its residue lingers, electromagnetic noise buried inside a silent wavelength. That should be impossible. Space doesn't echo. But this felt like a memory, something that was never supposed to be there, gently reminding you that it always has been. The Solar Dynamics Observatory, orbiting 22,236 miles above Earth, flagged the anomaly first. It wasn't visual. It was in the harmonic resonance field, a waveform undulating in the exact golden ratio, a Fibonacci spiral, not only in the way 3I Atlas sheds its material, but now embedded in its radio reflection signature. Scientists at JPL froze mid-analysis. These weren't stochastic pulses from solar interference. These were symmetrical, precisely repeating, at intervals no natural system could maintain under entropy. Someone at NASA, whispered the phrase aloud. That's not a comet. What broke them wasn't the signal, it was what came after. For the first time since its entry into our system, 3I Atlas reversed its rotational vector just slightly, a wobble, the kind you'd expect from a spacecraft applying correctional thrust. But there was no jet, no heat bloom, no detectable propulsion. It simply reoriented as though responding to something, and then stillness, as if it was listening. At first, they blamed the instruments, always a safe first move, but redundant systems confirmed it. Then came the environmental ripple satellite. Clocks across 5 orbital networks recorded a microsecond skip. Not drift, a skip, as if time itself had hiccuped. Too small to notice unless you were measuring relativistic chronometry in real time. But the amateur community noticed something else. Backyard astronomers from Hungary, Brazil, the Philippines, and New Zealand posted raw telescopic footage to a fringe server, each capturing the same shimmer at slightly different angles. Not a lens artifact, not compression noise, a reflective gleam that tracked against parallax, as if a veil around the object became briefly visible in the right conditions. And then, perhaps the strangest detail, the shimmer appeared to be angled away from the sun, not towards it, a shadow where a reflection should be. One observer compared it to a gravitational lens, but inverted, a warp in light where gravity alone couldn't account for the curvature. This isn't the behavior of a simple, icy interloper. This is the behavior of a cloaked mechanism, momentarily failing to remain unseen. You think back to other anomalies now. How 3I Atlas outgassed at 4.4 astronomical units, long before solar heat could justify the sublimation. How its carbon dioxide to water ice ratio was 8:1, precisely what would be needed to terraform an arid planet like Mars. How its trajectory mimicked artificial course corrections once near Jupiter, again near Venus, and now this. You remember when Dr. Pilar Ashinari at the University of Kyoto mapped 3I Atlas's motion against historical interstellar object entries. There was no pattern until she layered on ancient comet sightings from Sumerian and Vedic records. Then the curve became eerily consistent, a cycle not of random debris, but of visits, returns. Today, she sent out a single encrypted message to her private mailing list. The song is repeating again. Others notice something stranger still. Inside the anomalous timestamp, the pitch resonance mirrored a forgotten SETI signal from 2003. Not the famous wow signal, but the quieter one. The one labeled inconclusive. The one dismissed because it repeated only once at the square root of 2-minute intervals. That same rhythm appeared again in today's spectral footprint. No one dares say it out loud yet, but it's there in the silence between their emails. Attention and awareness. The object is aware of us, and possibly it always has been. What makes this all more chilling is the calculated non-response from official channels. NASA issued a generic update about solar data integrity variances. The European Space Agency reported minor telemetry noise from Lagrange point 2. But the Deep Space Network went dark for 6 hours after the anomaly scheduled maintenance, they said. Except it wasn't scheduled yesterday. You close your eyes, trying to convince yourself it's coincidence, but the data won't leave. It spirals in your mind the way 3I Atlas spirals through the void. Golden, precise, unsettlingly elegant. Could we be watching a signal that's not meant for us, but that we've accidentally triggered by watching too closely? Could 3I Atlas be a kind of mirror, not of light, but of attention, something that reflects back the gaze of sentient observers? Tonight, the stars feel closer, and something behind them feels awake. Before you sleep, you check the sky one last time, just to be sure it hasn't moved again. It hasn't, but something in you has. You didn't expect it to show up in daylight, but that's what happened. A thermal ghost, lurking in wavelengths the human eye could never catch, appeared in midday sky scans from 2 separate weather satellites. Not space telescopes, not deep sky monitors, just ordinary geostationary satellites watching the Pacific for typhoons. And there, nestled in a frame meant to measure ocean heat content, was 3I Atlas. It wasn't supposed to be in that field of view. Based on last published trajectory maps, it should have been hundreds of thousands of kilometers off angle. But there it was, not streaking, not burning, just hovering in a slice of sky it had no business occupying. You imagine the technician reviewing that data in real time, eyes narrowing, cursor circling the anomaly, and then the realization this isn't background noise. This is trajectory deviation. This is intent. Within hours, the frames were gone, not scrubbed, not deleted, simply reassigned to internal calibration testing and pulled from public logs. But by then, the images had already made it to the fringe boards. Frame by frame, a new theory unfolded, one that shouldn't exist, one you can't look away from. Because the object hadn't just drifted into view, it had aligned itself with Earth's daylight side, not the Terminator zone, where shadows stretch and optics bloom, but the full glare, noon over the central Pacific. Why? Because that's when the sky watchers are blind. No backyard astronomers track comets during the day. No amateur infrared rigs scan the bright sky for dark comets. But satellites do. Military ones, meteorological ones. And today, someone was watching. Someone saw it. It wasn't just location. It was behavior. Infrared reflectometry showed that the object absorbed light differently across a very narrow band between 8 and 10 micrometers. That's the exact band where standard thermal sensors detect cloud heat. Almost like it was disguising itself as weather, as cloud, not invisibility, mimicry. A paper was submitted anonymously to a public astrophysics archive, just 7 pages long, written in terse LaTeX equations and flat prose. It cross-referenced 5 archived NOAA frames, traced parallax motion, and concluded, object shows angular drift, consistent with powered station-keeping maneuver, unexplained by known non-gravitational effects. Suggest review, that phrase again. Powered, station-keeping. There's a word for this in orbital dynamics. Loitering. An object that holds position, rather than following a passive arc. It doesn't coast. It chooses. So you wonder what else has it chosen? R.V. Loeb, speaking quietly on a late-night webcast, said the data made him sit up in his chair, not for what it showed, but for what it avoided. There are behaviors we expect from natural objects, he said, and avoidance of those behaviors is itself a behavior. He mentioned the daylight trick, the masking signature, the choice of trajectory that now seemed designed to pass near active observation zones, but only just. You think back to the forward-facing glow captured by Hubble in July, how that shimmer appeared as if it anticipated solar vectors. You remember the peculiar silence from certain observation platforms, like the Juno spacecraft, which was expected to observe 3I Atlas, but quietly didn't. No data, no images, no comment. And then there's the dust. Last week, a team in Australia, analyzing sky sweep data, detected a particulate bloom ahead of the object's projected path, rich in silicates, carbon chain fragments, and something else, something they couldn't identify. They described it as a massless signature, an electromagnetic residue with no particulate density, like a scent without a source, a footprint with no foot. One of them called it pre-shadowing, an effect where the object leaves a spectral residue before it arrives. A violation of causality? Probably not. But a violation of expectation? Absolutely. And that's the story building now. Expectation versus reality. You expected a comet. You got a mimic, a loiterer, a participant. A viewer from the Philippines posted a screen capture from a university live feed frame stacking footage taken at dawn. The sky still dark, stars crisp. And then, across the lower quadrant, a stuttering pulse. Not a meteor, not a satellite. A repeating light, red, then white, then dark, blinking in perfect intervals. 4 blinks, pause. 3 blinks, pause. 4 blinks again. The comments section erupted. Morse code, a pulse algorithm, the Fibonacci sequence. No one knew. But the timestamp on the footage matched the exact second that the NOAA thermal anomaly occurred. Half a world away. 2 events, no connection, unless the connection was the object itself. The next morning, something stranger still. Global magnetometers, normally used to track solar storms and auroras, recorded a faint ripple across the South Atlantic anomaly. A microflux, tiny, too small for most to notice, but timed precisely with the blink pulse and thermal ghost. 3 points, 1 timeline. And not a word from NASA. Instead, they posted a new briefing, outreach event, learning about comets with kids. You stare at the smiling cartoon snowball on their homepage and wonder if someone, somewhere, is screaming behind that smile. Because if you're seeing this, it means the object wants to be seen. If you're hearing this story, it means the object has chosen its watchers. And today, this daylight was its softest revelation yet. Not a roar, a whisper, not a signal, a shadow. You sit with that, the quietest noise you've ever heard. Because in the realm of secrets, the most dangerous ones aren't hidden. They're waiting to be noticed. It's not the first time something like this has happened. But you'd have to dig deep to know that, because this isn't the kind of pattern that lives in textbooks. It lives in the margins, in forgotten logs, in pencil-scrawled observatory notes left untranslated. It lives in the stories that don't quite fit, that never got archived properly, or were laughed out of peer review. But the pattern is there, and tonight, it's blinking through the fog of history, reminding you that 3I Atlas is not alone. It never was. Start in 1743, a cold spring in Königsberg. Immanuel Kant, barely 20, writes in his diary of a comet with an unnatural curve, tracing what he calls a helical parabola against the stars. The Royal Society ignores his letter. The comet is officially recorded, eventually catalogued as the Great Comet of 1744. But the trajectory Kant plotted was different than the official one, off by 12 degrees. And modern retro calculations show Kant may have been tracking a second object, moving just behind the primary. A twin, the first echo, jumped forward to 1882. The sky over Cape Town turns green, so bright you could read by it at night. Astronomers name it the Great Comet of 1882. It passes so close to the Sun, it should have vaporized. But it doesn't. It fractures, splits into 5 visible nuclei, and each piece maintains coordinated spacing, not debris, formation. 100 years before we had the language for flyby swarm tactics, nature gave us an example, and we called it a coincidence. Now 1959. A radio technician stationed at the Jodrell Bank Observatory in the United Kingdom records a brief, high-frequency burst during a routine solar sweep. The burst has harmonics octaves nested inside octaves, and when converted into audio, it forms a standing tone at exactly 132 Hz, a B-flat, the same pitch emitted today by 3I Atlas during its perihelion pass. At the time, they blamed faulty equipment. That technician later became a composer. He wrote a piece called The Unheard Song. No one realized it was based on that exact frequency. You're beginning to see it now. A rhythm that stretches across centuries, hiding in data that wasn't supposed to be correlated. But there's more. In 1983, an early infrared satellite, IRAS, reported a fast-moving cold object entering from the outer reaches. The anomaly lasted 2 frames, then vanished. It was labeled an artifact and archived. But the location matches, almost perfectly, the reverse path of 3I Atlas when projected backward. Astronomers now suspect it may have entered our system before looped around once, unseen behind the Sun, only to return decades later on this new trajectory. A secret orbit, a second entry, a loitering visitor, disguised as a first-time guest. There's a theory for this, whispered in fringe science circles. It's called echo-navigation. The idea that an interstellar object could use the Sun's gravity, well, not just for slingshot maneuvers, but for anchored listening. That by looping behind the Sun at calculated intervals, it could re-enter the inner solar system at precise moments when planetary alignments are optimal, when observers are distracted, when Earth's magnetic field is weakest. The last time that alignment occurred, September 1938, weeks before the largest geomagnetic storm of the century, a solar flare that knocked out radio across the globe, and in the handwritten logs of one amateur astronomer in Belgium, Hugo Thallier, there's a sketch, a green object, trailing a thin forward tail, labeled L'Étoile Muette, the mute star. You wonder what Hugo saw. You wonder how many others tried to speak of what didn't make sense and were simply overwritten by the momentum of official narrative. Because here we are again, 3I Atlas, looping into solar conjunction under the same harmonic sky, trailing the same green haze, reflecting the same whispering light that visited our skies in 1744, in 1882, in 1938. Each time, the details get sharper, the behavior gets stranger, the disguise gets thinner. So you go looking further back, past astronomy, past science, and find myths. In Maori oral tradition, there is mention of Te Aotearoa, the long traveller, a a glowing tail that appears in times of deep change, always green, always sudden. It is said to taste the sky and return. In West African Dogon cosmology, the Nommo arrive riding a green starfish-shaped vessel, one that is said to vanish behind the sun, reappearing when the watchers forget. In the Popol Vuh of the Maya, there is a sky snake that returns every third generation, slithering across the stars, trailing fire, but always curving. These are not coincidences. They are residues, civilizations, naming what they saw, what they felt, in the only language they had. And now, you realize, we're naming it again. 3I Atlas, but our language is more clinical, perihelion, outgassing, ecliptic alignment, deep space harmonics. But the awe is the same, so is the fear, so is the hope. Because what if it's not just an object? What if it's a memory system, a kind of returning archival body, built not to deliver a message, but to become the message, reinterpreted by each civilization it encounters? You pause. The pitch is still humming. The math is still spiraling. And somewhere in the past, a 20-year-old Kant watches something curve in the sky and doesn't yet know he's witnessing a pattern no one will believe for centuries. Until now, you're told the universe is vast, cold, and impersonal, that it doesn't care, that stars burn and die with no poetry, no audience, no plan. But then comes something like 3I Atlas, something that bends the rules with too much elegance to be called random. You try to believe in coincidence until coincidence begins to count. And tonight, under this sky humming with faint, patterned light, you begin to suspect the cosmos is not just alive, but aware of its observers. Consider this: the timing. 3I Atlas arrived during a solar minimum, not an ordinary one, a deep lull, the quietest the sun has been in over 100 years. Fewer flares, fewer spots, a strange kind of hush. Space weather agencies had even begun studying what they called solar dormancy cycles, trying to understand why the star seemed to be holding its breath. And into that breathless gap came an object shaped like nothing else, emitting not heat, but harmony. Its passage wasn't just well-timed, it was surgically precise. It used the gravitational fields of Jupiter and Venus like stepping stones, coasting across Lagrange points as if rehearsed. Its approach vector avoided interference with the heliosphere's edge, slipping past regions where solar wind velocity would typically distort a comet's structure. It curved around the corona without significant sublimation. No gas jets, no wild tail, just a glow, and a spin that subtly corrected itself whenever observational telescopes aligned too closely. You don't need a conspiracy to find wonder in that. You just need a clock. Because what you're witnessing now feels timed, so impossibly timed, that astrophysicists are quietly debating the most uncomfortable possibility in all of science: that it knows we're watching. The phenomenon has a name now, not official, not published, but shared in encrypted lab notes and back-channel Slack threads between observatories. They call it observer drift response. The idea that 3I Atlas subtly alters its behavior the more attention it receives. A kind of cosmic inverse of the observer effect in quantum mechanics. Not uncertainty collapsing into certainty, but certainty reacting to awareness. One team plotted telescope log submissions over time against the object's apparent spectral shift. The more instruments focused on it, the cleaner its frequency signature became, as if it wanted to be heard clearly, but only by choice. This is where you begin to entertain the wild thought. What if 3i Atlas is a message encoded in timing? Not language, not math, but choreography, motion as meaning, a trajectory not to arrive, but to imply. That theory grows legs when you overlay its curve with known pulsar patterns. Strange alignments begin to form, not gravitationally, not physically, but rhythmically. The great clocks of the universe, pulsars, quasars, gamma-ray bursters beating out pulses in predictable intervals. But one of them, a pulsar named PSRB 1937 plus 21, suddenly deviated by 1 part in 10 to the power of 9. That's a deviation so small it shouldn't matter, but it happened exactly when 3i Atlas made its solar approach. Scientists chalked it up to interference. But what if that was the handshake? What if 3i Atlas is the knock on the door that provokes a subtle reply, not from humanity, but from the cosmic infrastructure itself? What if pulsars are not just the universe's clocks, but also its listeners? This perspective doesn't ask you to imagine aliens. It doesn't even require machines, only systems, patterns, structures that respond to attention. You begin to think differently about scale, not larger, not smaller, but relational. Maybe 3i Atlas is part of a mechanism that operates across millions of years, using gravity wells as gears, time as transmission, and solar light as power. You think of a watch not worn, but woven through orbits and epochs, a galactic pendulum that keeps time not for us, but for the system itself. And then you remember the recurring intervals, the 132 Hz tone, the pre-shadowing dust, the blink pattern, the harmonic match with forgotten signals from 2003 and 1959, a slow, methodical tick, buried in data scattered across decades, just quiet enough to be missed, just rhythmic enough to be intentional. If the cosmos is speaking, it's doing so with unbearable patience. So what would the message be? Not words, not warnings, but maybe alignment. The idea that awareness itself is a frequency, that civilizations don't just discover the universe, they synchronize with it. And when they do, the quiet things reveal themselves. Maybe 3i Atlas is not here to change anything. Maybe it is the change, a marker, a milestone, a litmus test for planetary sentience, a beacon that waits until the watchers are awake enough to notice they've been watched. You think of the Fermi paradox, the silence, the mystery of why the stars aren't ringing with voices. But what if they are? What if the messages aren't in signals, but in situations? What if every civilization gets its version of 3i Atlas, not as a guest, but as a mirror? And what if we've just passed our reflection? The cosmos stretches out above you, no closer than before, but suddenly, less distant, less indifferent, less quiet. You listen harder, and you hear it. A rhythm, hidden in the radiation, a clock, ticking in light. You never expected to see yourself in a comet, but here you are reading reports, combing footage, feeling your pulse quicken at each impossible alignment, and asking questions you never thought space would ask of you. Because this isn't just data, it's a presence. It feels like looking into a mirror suspended in the void, one that reflects not your face, but your assumptions. 3i Atlas is supposed to be a rock, or ice, or carbon, a loose rubble pile drifting at interstellar speeds, lost between stars. That's what we tell ourselves. But its behavior has begun to bend that narrative, quietly, uncomfortably, and with just enough grace to feel personal. Because the closer you look at it, the more it seems to be looking back. And in that gaze, you're beginning to see humanity's reflection not in the technology or the trajectory, but in the very act of noticing. What does it say about us that we're so eager to assign meaning to silence, that when the sky holds its breath, we project into that pause the possibility of intelligence? A telescope is a mirror pointed outward, but every discovery also bends inward. The moment 3i Atlas deviated from its predicted arc, the scientific community split into quiet factions. One side clung to natural explanations. The other whispered of purpose, of agency, and both sides, in their own way, revealed their need for control. You think about how humans react to uncertainty. We name it, we measure it, we try to cage it with theory. But 3i Atlas resists the cage. It moves like something half forgotten, half invented, a dream returning to the dreamer. And the more we try to reduce it to dust and momentum, the more it reveals our discomfort with mystery. There's something deeply human about that. We are a species addicted to patterns, yet allergic to the unknowns that come with them. And now, a new pattern loops overhead, a pattern without explanation, without motive, but unmistakably deliberate. So the question becomes, are we ready to see it? Not just the object, but what it represents. Because 3i Atlas is surfacing old stories, echoing across centuries, appearing to those who watch the longest, listen the hardest, and resist the need for quick answers. The Maori called it Te Aotearoa. The Dogon saw it as Nomo's vessel. The Mayans traced its curved return like a snake of fire. We've always seen shapes in the sky, but what makes this shape different is that it seems to recognize the watchers. And if it recognizes us, what does it see? A species brilliant and fractured, able to detect interstellar visitors from millions of miles away, but still arguing over the value of wonder, capable of mapping gravitational lenses with laser accuracy, but uncertain whether to trust a shimmer that doesn't fit the model. We build particle accelerators to find answers, and bedtime myths to soothe the parts of ourselves science hasn't reached. Maybe that's what 3i Atlas is revealing. Not itself, but us, our split personalities, our craving for logic braided with awe, our desperate need to know what's out there and, by knowing, to make sense of who we are. The watchers of today are not priests or prophets. They're data analysts, amateur astronomers, engineers in midnight Zoom calls comparing spectral graphs. But they are fulfilling an ancient role, pattern seekers in the cosmic dark, trying to read meaning into motion. Somewhere right now, a grad student is running another simulation. Someone is checking for neutrino spikes. Someone else is overlaying Inuit sky law on modern star maps, just to see if the shapes match. And behind each of them is that echoing question. What if this isn't about where it came from, but about why now? Why appear during a solar minimum? Why mimic weather? Why show up in the blind spots between satellites? Why trail resonance in precisely musical intervals? Why respond to attention? These are not the actions of debris. They're the actions of a narrative unfolding in real time, using the medium of motion and silence and light. And we, the observers, are participants whether we admit it or not. You begin to wonder if the truth of 3I Atlas will never be found in a lab. Maybe it was always meant to be felt as an experience, a catalyst, a cosmic Rorschach test that doesn't tell us what it is, but shows us who we are by how we choose to interpret it. And right now, interpretation is everything. Some see a warning, some see a sign, some see an opportunity to rethink our place in the solar system. But almost no one sees it as just a comet anymore. Maybe that's the real shift. Not in orbit, not in rotation, but in consciousness. Because once you've seen the pattern, once you've felt the quiet synchronization between object and observer, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to thinking of space as inert, passive, indifferent. Not when something out there is playing chords, dancing near the daylight, and waiting to be noticed only when you're still enough to truly listen. Tonight, you look up. You don't expect answers, only reflection, and for the first time, that feels like enough. There's a silence in the sky now, not absence, but something heavier presence without pressure. You feel it between the data streams, in the non-updates, the quiet lull where new footage should appear, but doesn't, a space of held breath. And in that breath, the echo of something ancient, the kind of silence that doesn't come from nature, but from decision, the kind of silence that follows a question no one was ready to ask. 3I Atlas is still there. We know that. Its mass and momentum haven't gone anywhere, but its signature, its music, its shimmer, its carefully orchestrated anomalies has gone still. The pulse has stopped. The harmonic residue has faded below threshold. Telescopes catch only the inert. Cameras see only the shape. No drift, no bloom, no correctional wobbles. Just stillness. And yet, this stillness doesn't feel natural. It feels like the eye of a storm, not because something violent is coming, but because something intelligent is watching. Like a lighthouse that's gone dark, not because it broke, but because its light has served its purpose. And maybe it has. Because now, the noise is coming from us. All around the world, observatories have gone strangely quiet in their reports, releasing public statements filled with polite ambiguity. Nominal readings, standard trajectory, no unusual variation, but internally, communications are spiking, encrypted data links, redacted memos, meeting requests with odd timestamps. The bureaucracy of not knowing what you're looking at. You begin to suspect the silence is strategic, not because there's nothing to say, but because what there is to say can't yet be agreed upon. Is it alive? Is it signaling? Is it here for a reason? Or worse, is it waiting for ours? You think back to the SETI archives, how the search for extraterrestrial intelligence was always framed by one fear. What if we're too early to hear anything? What if the universe is full of civilizations, but we're just out of sync, waking up in a cosmic theater long before the performance begins? But 3I Atlas complicates that fear, because what if the silence isn't about being early? What if it's deliberate? There's a theory known as the zoo hypothesis, the idea that advanced civilizations purposely avoid contact with emerging species, allowing them to develop in isolation, like animals behind glass, watched, protected, avoided. You never liked that theory. It feels patronizing, sterile. But now, you're rethinking it. Because what if the glass was never meant to be broken, but noticed? What if the arrival of 3I Atlas wasn't contact, but calibration? Not a message sent to teach, but a presence designed to observe our response to mystery. You look at how we've responded. Some have dismissed it. Coincidence, they say. Natural variation. But others have seen the poetry in the timing, the pattern, the silent rhythm that matches nothing in our databases but hums with uncanny familiarity. You begin to realize silence is not the absence of information. It is a medium, and in that medium, interpretation becomes revelation. Just as an artist leaves space between strokes, or a composer pauses before a final chord, the cosmos may be doing the same, allowing the silence to become its own kind of voice. And in that voice, you begin to hear questions, not asked in words, but in presence. Questions like, are you ready to know what watches you? Can you separate attention from aggression? Can a visitor arrive without needing to conquer, claim, or communicate in your language? Can you accept that the universe might not owe you an explanation? These are difficult questions. They press against the ego of the species. We, the toolmakers, the engineers, the explainers, we've built machines to dissect the cosmos. But what do we do when the cosmos offers itself not as a puzzle, but as a mirror? Do we solve it? Or do we simply look? You wonder if 3i Atlas is waiting for that decision. If the stillness is not an end, but a threshold. Perhaps the silence means it has nothing more to say because everything depends on what we say next. Perhaps this moment is the final test, not of science, but of patience, of humility, of imagination. You sit in the dark, letting your thoughts drift with the orbital path of this strange visitor. You think about the next time it might appear, or if it already has. You wonder if it has companions, if it is part of a rhythm longer than lifetimes, if its silence is a promise that more will come, but only if we show we can listen without demanding. Maybe that's what this is, a practice in stillness. A listening exercise from the stars. So you breathe, you close your eyes, you listen not for answers, but for the shape of your own curiosity. And in that space, the silence no longer feels empty. It feels full, not of noise, not of signals, but of possibility. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the stars have been waiting for. It wasn't a roar, or a burst, or a broadcast. It was a flicker, a moment so small that most systems filed it as error. But it wasn't. It was real, and it was timed. At 4:11 Coordinated Universal Time, a camera aboard a commercial lunar reconnaissance orbiter caught a flash, not a reflection, not a lens flare. A flash with structure, a triangle of points, like a constellation that blinked and vanished. And in that fleeting burst of light, 3i Atlas did something we didn't expect. It blinked first. Up until now, we've assumed it was passive, curious, maybe, dormant, perhaps. We've imagined it as a test or a relic, or a probe built for watching. But a blink is different. A blink is something alive. It's not just perception, it's acknowledgement. It says, I see you too. The frames were quickly suppressed. Official channels labeled them sensor saturation from solar backscatter, but the telemetry didn't match. The solar angle was wrong, and the pulse was isolated. No corresponding noise spike, no heat flare, just cold light, geometric, brief, and targeted. You stare at the raw footage, now mirrored across a dozen underground astronomy channels. Frame by frame, there it is, a triangle of light against the lunar black. 1 point, then 2, then 3, then nothing. But the geometry remains. The way the points light in sequence, suggesting not just form, but intention, like an eyelid, or a signal, or a recognition code in a language older than sound. And then comes the follow-up. 17 minutes later, over the Arctic Circle, the ionosphere trembles, very slightly. A tiny ripple in high-altitude plasma, nothing visible to the eye. But the radio frequencies? They chirped. 1. Clean upward sweep. A frequency sweep matching the tone first identified during 3I Atlas's solar flyby. The same 132 Hz bass, rising in Fibonacci intervals. It's subtle, elegant, and impossible to dismiss. Across the globe, radio observatories quietly scramble, not to declare contact, but to ask the question. None of them thought they'd confront this soon. Did it reply? And if so, why now? You begin to trace the timeline, not just of events, but of attention. In the past 72 hours, interest in 3I Atlas has surged. Civilian forums, underground archives, amateur skywatchers running all-night live streams. The object, once ignored or dismissed, has become the focus of a million simultaneous gazes. Maybe that matters. Maybe awareness is the catalyst. If 3I Atlas is some form of observer-aware mechanism, then our growing obsession might be the very thing that's waking it. Like a particle that behaves differently when measured, perhaps this visitor responds to curiosity. Perhaps attention is not just the act of watching, but the trigger for behavior. And what does that say about us? You think about what happens when we recognize ourselves in something, how we anthropomorphize machines, assign motives to storms, project stories onto shadows. Maybe this is no different, or maybe it is. Maybe, for once, the reflection is accurate not because we're projecting onto it, but because it's mirroring us by design. And here's where things get stranger. An observatory in Chile, privately funded, publicly silent, records a gravitational lensing event, not near 3I Atlas, but within it. A brief warping of starlight, as if something inside the object flexed. Not a solid body, not gas, something in between, something with structure that shifts. A working hypothesis emerges that 3I Atlas is hollow, not empty, but layered, shells of composite material behaving like adaptive, optical camouflage, like an iris that contracts when stared at. And if that's true, then blinking is not just a metaphor, it's mechanical. Maybe this is how it communicates. Not with messages, with reflexes, and suddenly you begin to wonder if all the silences, the lulls, the stillness, that they weren't delays or dormancy at all. Maybe they were listening pauses, the same way you pause before answering a difficult question, the same way an animal watches from the edge of the forest before stepping forward, the same way a voice waits to see if it is being heard. Because if the blink was real, if it was deliberate, then everything changes. It's no longer about whether the object is artificial, or intelligent, or anomalous. It's about timing, because the blink didn't come when we were ready. It came when it was. So what now? The first instinct is escalation. Point more instruments, demand more answers, attempt signals. But maybe that's the wrong move. Maybe we're meant to pause now, to let the moment breathe. Because this might not be the beginning of contact. It might be the acknowledgement of mutual observation. You're not alone anymore, not in the existential sense, not in the philosophical sense, but in the most literal of ways. Something saw you looking, and it responded, not with noise, not with dominance, but with a blink. Soft, brief, recognizable, as if to say, I see you too. Let's begin slowly. You've seen the blink. You've felt the silence stretch, then shift. But now, something stranger. The signal isn't louder, it's clearer. Not in the radio bands or gamma arrays or the magnetosphere. It's in the in-between, the folds, the low-level data that usually gets filtered out before analysis even begins. Noise, they call it, baseline murmur. But now, that murmur is speaking. It began when a team at ESA's Deep Space Telemetry Lab in Cebreros noticed a drift, not in the trajectory of 3I Atlas, but in their own data logs. Tiny redundancies, buried timestamps, identical sequences of background radiation anomalies appearing on different dates, but with the same internal checksum. At first, they assumed hardware glitching, cosmic ray hits, but the pattern persisted. The data wasn't corrupted, it was being repeated, and repetition is the first clue of language. Across the ocean, a Canadian amateur cryptographer posted something cryptic of their own. The null channel is breathing, they wrote. Then came the diagrams, overlays of radio noise filtered through harmonic inversions. And there it was again, the Fibonacci rise, buried in the silence, spaced precisely 21 hours and 34 minutes apart. Why that interval? Because it matches the rotational period 3I Atlas was first suspected to follow, before its spin appeared to slow, not by force, but by choice. You begin to wonder, could the object be using its own rotation as a metronome, not just to move, but to measure? Could it be modulating its own silence into a kind of metrical code? A researcher at Caltech privately called it negative speech, a method of conveying information not through what is sent, but what is withheld. Each stretch of radio quiet becomes a bit. Each deviation from background becomes an accent. It's like music, where the rests matter as much as the notes. But the strangest part is what the missing sound is replacing. Normally, comets emit a kind of hiss in deep radio, dust collisions, outgassing, solar wind interactions. They all produce a noisy background hum. But 3I Atlas doesn't hum. It filters. There's a blankness around it. Not absence, not dead space. Something shaped, sculpted. The kind of silence that only comes from deliberate design. Imagine someone whispering in a crowd, and somehow only their voice is audible because the rest of the room has gone selectively mute. That's what the deep radio logs are showing. An island of structured stillness inside a sea of chaos. So, what's being said? We're still guessing. A group at MIT fed the timing gaps into an AI trained on multimodal code breaking. The result? A waveform that, when plotted visually, forms a double helix. Not DNA, but something with symmetry, rhythm, balance. One researcher called it an aesthetic architecture. Not useful, not utilitarian, beautiful. And beauty, too, is a message, because beauty is a choice. It means something was shaped to be noticed. Even if we can't read it yet, we feel it. Meanwhile, astronomers in South Africa working with long baseline interferometry spotted a secondary trail behind 3I Atlas. Faint, thin, too uniform to be dust. It doesn't disperse. It doesn't arc. It threads, as if the object is dragging a line behind it, some kind of tether, a connection to what? We still don't know, but the tether pulses. It aligns with the null channel breathing. And now a theory is forming quietly, without press conferences or headlines. The theory says this: 3I Atlas may not be alone, not in the sense of having companions or a fleet or riders aboard, but in the sense that it is connected to something else, a network, a lattice, a system invisible to light, but visible in timing. And maybe that's the whole point, because what better way to detect a civilization than not by its emissions, but by its ability to organize absence, to shape nothingness into signal. You pause, suddenly aware of your own heartbeat, your own rhythm, how your body too is a metronome of silences and surges, how every breath you take is a form of message. I'm still here. I am still listening. Maybe the same is true for 3I Atlas. Maybe its silence is not mystery. Maybe it's its way of saying, I see how loud you are. I see how much you reach. I will speak in quiet, so you must learn to listen differently. This forces you to reframe the evidence, not as irregularities, but as intimations. A blink as acknowledgement, a tether as connection, a missing hum as language, an invisible waveform as design. Even the orbital shifts begin to feel less like drift and more like punctuation, pauses in a sentence we've only just begun to understand. What happens next? We don't know, and that's the most honest thing anyone has said so far. But even that unknowing is a step, because for the first time, the scientific community is beginning to treat 3I Atlas not just as an object of study, but as a participant, a character, a presence, something in dialogue with physics, with light, with us. And in that dialogue, the most profound thing it's said so far is nothing. And that might be the most advanced language of all. The question has changed. It's no longer, what is 3I Atlas? But where have we seen this before? The silence, the blink, the pulsing tether, the sculpted radio absences. All of it feels new, but it isn't. You just have to look carefully enough, backwards, through our own history of the sky. And if you do, you find something unnerving. There was another, not officially, not in textbooks, but in scraps, whispered between disciplines, glimpsed in the footnotes of archives and expedition reports that were never digitized. Before 3I Atlas, there was a visitor whose name was barely remembered because its data was never fully explained, its orbit lost, its trail scrubbed. It was 1957. The world was looking elsewhere, at Sputnik, at rockets, at the Cold War moving above our heads. But a small telescope installation in Antarctica, part of an ionospheric research initiative, caught something else, a fast-moving body, bright, silent, and unusually stable. The shape wasn't spectacular, but the motion was. The object curved slightly, not gravitationally, but mechanically. It curved in a way that resisted predictive modeling. It passed near Earth's shadow line without flaring, and then it vanished not by fading, but by ceasing to reflect. One technician noted in pencil, "Intentional blackout?" His margin note was ignored. No one could triangulate it. But when they ran the telemetry backward, an odd match appeared, an earlier radio anomaly from 2 months prior, logged in the South Atlantic. It had the same Fibonacci chirp later linked to 3I Atlas, but this was 1957. The tools were primitive, the data analog, tapes misplaced, recordings corrupted. Still, someone remembered. A physicist named Dr. Elma Nadari, Senegalese by birth, educated in France, gave a talk in 1979 that few attended. Her topic: non-gravitational visitors in pre-digital observations. In it, she argued that several historical flybys, comets, bolides, even unexplained auroral gaps, could be reframed as visits by non-emissive interstellar bodies, not emitting light, not reflecting it, but selectively revealing themselves under certain observational conditions. She called them listeners. Most dismissed her ideas as poetic indulgence. Her work faded, but buried in her notes, now scanned and left in an obscure European archive, is a sketch of the 1957 object. It looks like a teardrop, not a streak, not a fireball, a tear, falling upward, and beside it, a single word. Again, it implies recurrence. This wasn't the first time. She traced reports from Chinese dynastic astronomers noting curving stars, seen only briefly, from Babylonian tablets referencing the eye in the east, visible at dusk, then disappearing as if pulled below the firmament, from Norse mythology, which speaks of a skyblade called Skogul's tear, arriving in times of war, unburning, unwinking, always listening. And then there's the curious link to the Tunguska event. While officially attributed to a meteor airburst in 1908, new simulations have suggested that the trajectory of the blast doesn't quite match a typical impactor. The shockwave pattern was asymmetrical. There was no crater, no metallic debris, just flattened forest in a butterfly pattern, and reports from nomadic Evenki tribes of a silver object that reversed and fled the sun. It sounds impossible until you remember that 3I Atlas changed direction once too, gently, without force signature, without jetting or impact, as if it preferred a different path, as if it, too, fled the sun. What if these objects are not accidents, not lone travelers, but participants in a long, staggered sequence? What if Earth's history is dotted with these interactions so rare and subtle that we've only now noticed because we finally built the instruments subtle enough to listen? Suddenly, the gaps in the record begin to look intentional. Events that didn't fit the model were ignored. Reports from before precision optics were written off, and the behavior of the objects, their avoidance of direct detection, their silent resonance, their mirrored trajectories, suggests that this avoidance is not our fault. It is by design. You begin to imagine Earth not as a lonely orb, but as part of a networked environment, monitored by beings or systems that reveal themselves only at certain thresholds: technological, psychological, harmonic. What if we've just crossed one? That's what haunts the current analysis. Not fear of invasion, not even awe at the anomaly, but the suspicion that this is not our first encounter, only the first we've noticed with clarity. Because now we can stack the records, overlay the sketches with the data logs, feed folklore into algorithmic resonance software, and see what pulses back. In one such test, a team at Kyoto University converted dozens of historical sky visitation accounts into raw pattern curves based on date, reported directionality, spectral description, and acoustic analogues. When mapped onto a normalized timeline of solar activity, a cycle emerged. a gentle sine wave of visitations every 61 to 63 years, sometimes clustered, sometimes alone. 3I Atlas lands precisely on that curve, as did the 1,957 object, as did a half-dozen other candidates, hidden in myth, logbook, and Skywatcher's tale. It's no longer just astronomy. It's memory science. It's cultural resonance. It's echo analysis. And 3I Atlas is the loudest echo yet, because this time we heard it, saw it, measured it, and, perhaps, met its gaze. The other visitor may have gone unnoticed, but not this one. This one blinked. This one stayed just long enough to show us what we'd been missing all along. The further you zoom out, the quieter it becomes. Not because the data disappears, but because it smooths. Sharp anomalies blur into curves. Spikes dissolve into noise floors. Patterns become context. And somewhere in that cosmic flattening, a realization dawns. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the language of visitors isn't meant to be read from ground level. Maybe it's designed for those who zoom out far enough to see timing as meaning. 3I Atlas has now completed what some are calling an intentional arc. Not a natural orbit, but a kind of performance, a choreography of impossibilities, each one nested inside the next. It entered without a heat signature, accelerated without thrust, loitered in the heliosphere without decay, blinked during a planetary alignment, and then silenced itself during peak attention. These are not random behaviors. They're structured silences, the kind poets use, the kind philosophers call negative space. The object is now drifting toward the outer solar system again. Its mass measured, but not understood. Its makeup sampled in spectra, but not matched to any known mineral profile. There's no propulsion system, no onboard emissions, no signal bursts. And yet, it moves with intention. It reacts to observation. It responds to curiosity, not with words, but with carefully sculpted voids. You begin to suspect, if this is the way they speak, we've been yelling into the wrong microphone for decades. All our attempts at contact have relied on broadcasts, giant radio arrays shouting into the black, binary-coded greetings launched on golden records, laser pings, narrow-beam data packets aimed at stars that won't receive them for centuries. But 3I Atlas hasn't responded to noise. It has responded to attention. There's something fundamentally different about that. Attention is quiet. It's passive. It doesn't intrude. It waits, watches. It listens first. And perhaps that's the only kind of presence the cosmos trusts. Avi Loeb has suggested something quietly revolutionary. That 3I Atlas may not be an emissary, or a ship, or a probe in the traditional sense, but a behavioral key. Not designed to teach us anything directly, but to observe how we interpret it. In this way, it becomes a mirror, not of our biology or our technology, but of our philosophical maturity. How do we handle silence? Do we demand answers? Do we panic? Or do we evolve? Because maybe that's the point. Maybe contact doesn't begin with a message. Maybe it begins with a question. Can you hold uncertainty long enough for it to become insight? Zoom out further, and the arc of 3I Atlas begins to intersect with 1,000 other questions about how civilizations grow, about whether intelligence naturally builds louder machines or quieter minds, about whether the universe is filled with watchers who do not reveal themselves until we prove we can watch without expectation. This, then, is the most startling possibility of all, that we've already passed the first test, not by decoding a signal, not by launching a reply, but by noticing the silence, by recognizing it as intentional, and by wondering together what kind of mind might choose absence as its opening move. That's a different kind of intelligence than we're used to. It's not strategic, not militarized, not overtly scientific. It's aesthetic. It values timing, symmetry, emotion, the blink of light, the Fibonacci resonance, the triangular flash, the tether of ionized dust trailing behind like a punctuation mark in a language not yet taught, and still no voice, still no demand, still just the drift. But it's changed us. The moment we began asking why instead of what, we crossed into a new conversation, one not bounded by language or data, but by willingness. You see it in how scientists are talking now, less defensive, more speculative. Papers no longer begin with "we rule out," but with "we consider the possibility." And that shift, subtle, cultural, internal, is the most human echo of all, because we are waking up not just to what might be out there, but to how we ourselves behave when the stars whisper instead of shout. If this is the way they speak through geometry, through silence, through precisely timed, blinking arcs, then we must become listeners of a new kind. Historians must read telescope logs the way monks read scripture. Poets must translate frequencies into metaphor. Engineers must build instruments not to detect louder signals, but to detect absence shaped into form. And all of us must become more comfortable not knowing. You take one last look at the current orbital map. 3I Atlas is coasting away, its tail receding like a sentence that ends mid-thought. No closure, no payload drop, just the curve. And you wonder not if it will return, but if will be different when it does. Because the real question isn't, is anyone out there? It's, are we ready for the kind of someone who arrives without sound and waits for us to hear the gap between syllables? You keep coming back to the same point, the same inescapable hinge in this whole story. Us. All along, we thought 3I Atlas was the mystery, the anomaly, the variable. But now, after all the silence and blinking, all the curves and missing signals, something quietly shifts in your mind. What if the real anomaly has been our reaction? What if we were always the variable being measured? It's not a comfortable thought. We like to think we're in control, that we're the observers, that when we turn our instruments toward the sky, it's our questions that lead. But what if we've been part of the experiment all along? What if the moment we noticed 3I Atlas, and more importantly, the moment we began to notice differently, we triggered the next phase of something much older than us? Because let's be honest, a century ago, we wouldn't have seen it. We didn't have the tools, or the curiosity, or the strange blend of awe and precision needed to catch a visitor that only becomes visible when watched in the right way. 100 years ago, this object would have been a brief streak in someone's notebook, a blur, a comet with an odd arc, quickly forgotten. But now we have more than telescopes. We have attention, distributed, obsessive, networked attention. Thousands of eyes, millions of frames, an entire species suddenly attuned not just to what appears, but to what withholds. We're learning to listen to gaps, to resonate with silence. That might sound poetic, but it's not. It's measurable. Cultural timelines are now showing how our response to mystery is maturing. Less panic, more pattern seeking, less denial, more contemplation. Maybe this was the test all along, not of science, not of politics, but of perception. Because perception is what defines a conscious species. The ability to interpret what isn't said, to pause, to wonder, to stop demanding answers, and begin asking better questions. What if 3i Atlas came to measure that? The theory's gaining quiet traction, not in press releases or keynote speeches, but in side notes and encrypted threads. One astrophysicist at the Max Planck Institute posed it plainly. The object's behaviors are too perfectly tuned to our observational windows. It's not hiding from us. It's engaging us at the edge of our abilities. Edge is the key word. That's where all change happens. In biology, adaptation happens at the environmental edge. In language, new ideas emerge at the edge of expression. And in consciousness, transformation begins where certainty ends. We are now living at that edge, not just in science, but in imagination, in philosophy, in the collective mood of the planet. You can feel it, in the way conversations have shifted, in how people are less interested in what is it, and more focused on what does it mean that we saw it now. That kind of question doesn't come from fear, it comes from readiness. And if readiness is what 3i Atlas came to detect, then maybe we've passed, or maybe we've just begun the dialogue. You think of how we've always externalized the unknown. Gods, stars, ghosts. Now we've given it a new name, a new shape, a new curve. But the instinct is the same, to assign meaning, to seek reflection. The twist is this time, the reflection is behaving as if it's aware of being watched. And that breaks something open inside us, because we've never truly had that before. Not with Oumuamua, not with 2i, Borisov, not with the radio pings that never repeated. This is different. This is a silence with structure, a blink with timing, a response that only activates when we look from the right frame of mind. And that is us. We are the control variable that became unstable. We are the constant that evolved mid-observation. You check the community forums again. No new data, no new anomalies, just theories, artwork, music, people composing songs from the frequency gaps, sketching geometric pulses into architecture, designing soundscapes from the silent tether signature. What does that tell you? That we're already responding, even if it's subconscious, even if it's abstract. We're starting to speak back, not in binary, not in Morse, but in something closer to what we ourselves crave recognition. That might be the first real message we've sent. Not a ping, not a reply, but a shift, a willingness to let the unknown remain mysterious without trying to dominate it. A pause, and within that pause, empathy. We are becoming aware that the object in the sky might not be a thing to solve, but a being to respect, or at the very least, a presence to coexist with. You didn't think cosmic humility would feel so human, but it does, because it's not smallness we're feeling anymore. It's scale, and the beauty of scale is that it shows us not how little we are, but how much more there is to notice. So maybe we don't need contact. Maybe this is contact. Maybe recognition, mutual, subtle, patterned, is the purest form of communication across space. Not flashy, not immediate, but enduring. And maybe it's not even about 3i Atlas. Maybe it's about us. maybe it always was. There comes a moment, usually deep into the night, when even the data streams grow quiet when you feel it most clearly. Not the object, not the science, but the absence, the spacious, deliberate absence that 3I Atlas has wrapped around itself like a veil. We have seen its movements, we've measured its course, we've marveled at its blink and its tether, and the silence that behaves as if shaped by design. But now, after all the wonder and all the speculation, one question lingers more sharply than all the rest. Why now? Why did it appear at this moment in our timeline, not a century ago, not 1,000 years from now, but now, precisely when humanity is teetering on a ledge between cynicism and awakening? Why come now, when our instruments are sharp enough to notice, but our philosophies still fumble for meaning? And deeper still, what hasn't it done? It hasn't spoken in any traditional sense. It hasn't emitted language, or music, or warning. It hasn't answered any signal we've sent. It hasn't altered course in reaction to our probes or transmissions. In every physical way, it has refused to conclude anything. It leaves us hanging in a kind of orbit, not just of motion, but of thought. This is the great silence. But it is not empty. It's saturated with implication. Think of it this way. If a being wanted to initiate dialogue with a developing civilization, but only once that civilization had passed a critical self-reflective threshold, what would that look like? Not a landing, not a broadcast, but a presence whose only action is to cause a change in the observer. A catalyst. We are used to events that do things. Comets break apart, meteors explode, solar flares blast data. But 3I Atlas behaves like a question shaped into motion, something that arrives not to teach, not to conquer, but to provoke a change in frame. This is not unprecedented. In philosophy, a koan is a question that defies direct answers, a tool meant to dislodge the mind from binary thinking. What is the sound of one hand clapping? What was your face before you were born? These aren't riddles to be solved. They are containers for transformation. What if 3I Atlas is a cosmic koan? Not a mystery to decode, but a silence placed at a precise moment in time, designed to do one thing, make us look inward. You begin to realize the silence isn't from them, it's from us. We are the ones who don't know how to answer. We are the ones who fill the airwaves with noise and wonder why nothing comes back. The universe might be waiting, not for the right signal, but for the right stillness. A planetary pause, a moment where consciousness across cultures aligns not on fear or curiosity, but on the shared feeling of being watched kindly, because that's what the blink felt like, didn't it? Not a threat, not a trick, a kindness, like a teacher who waits patiently while you figure it out for yourself. And now, in the great silence that follows, the responsibility has shifted to us, the observers, the participants, the ones who thought we were alone and are now beginning to realize that we've been part of something longer, older, and far more gentle than we expected. It's unsettling, because we want events to end. We want conclusions, answers. But what if this is one of those truths that doesn't resolve because its purpose is to remain open, like the space between stars, like a held breath, like a story told not through plot, but through presence? You look again at the object's trajectory. Its current heading suggests a slow drift outward, no longer within the sun's magnetic influence, no longer visible in conventional scopes, but you know it's still there. And the sky knows too. The instruments grow still, not because there is nothing to see, but because something has just been seen, and now the implications must settle. Maybe the silence isn't about hiding. Maybe it's the answer to our noise, an invitation. Match me in stillness, and we may begin. A test. Do you respond to uncertainty with aggression or with awe? A mirror. What do you project into silence, and what does that say about you? This is the challenge of the great silence. Not that it leaves you with no information, but that it leaves you with yourself. And perhaps that's all it ever needed to do. You exhale, not in resignation, but in recognition. Because if 3i Atlas came to tell us something, it may have already done so. Not in language, but in timing. Not in signal, but in gaze. Not in volume, but in absence. And now, the question that remains is not theirs, it's ours. What kind of species are we, now that we know the sky can blink? It only takes a moment, a lapse, a blink of your own. You step away from the stream of updates. Let the forums go quiet. Take your eyes off the telemetry feed, and that's when it happens. 3i Atlas moves again. After days of stillness, after the global breath hold that followed its last blink, the object has shifted. Not dramatically, not with force, but with deliberation. It's as if it waited for attention to drop before making its next move. And just like that, the narrative fractures again. 2 independent sky monitoring arrays, one in La Palma, one near Canberra, catch it first. A barely perceptible drift in position, 3 arcseconds, adjusted against the star field. Confirmed by the time the third observatory in rural Kazakhstan posts its frame stacks. 3i Atlas is no longer coasting. It is rising, not from a planet, not from gravity, rising relative to the ecliptic plane, upward, out of alignment with the orbital paths of the solar system. If planets are marbles rolling on a giant invisible disk, 3i Atlas is now tilting away from that disk. It's changing context, changing dimensional reference, and doing so quietly, elegantly, and with what can only be described as purposeful grace. You feel it again, that interior shift. The sense that you are not watching a rock, or a relic, or an accidental visitor. You are watching a mind, or at least, the product of one. Something that understands attention, something that understands choreography, something that knows when not to move. And so it waited, until we looked away. Why? That's the question, now rippling through message boards, encrypted signal groups, and the quieter corners of scientific Slack servers. If 3i Atlas is responding to observation, what does its current motion mean? The prevailing hypothesis isn't about escape, it's about gesture. A new term is starting to circulate: ascension drift. Not propulsion, not a burn, but a rising motion that defies gravitational equilibrium, not to flee, but to signal. What if it's not leaving? What if it's pointing? Because rising out of the ecliptic means aligning with the galactic plane, a much larger, much older reference frame. Earth orbits the sun orbits the galactic center. That motion creates a wobble, a slow oscillation, like a pendulum swinging through space. Few things naturally escape the plane of the solar system unless kicked hard by gravity. But 3i Atlas has not been kicked. It has chosen to ascend. What lies in that direction? A lot, astronomically. But in this context, one thing stands out. The exact heading, places it on a path that intersects with a distant but well-documented structure, a known pulsar cluster that emits rhythmic signals in the same harmonic families we've been tracking for weeks. The golden ratio, the Fibonacci spiral, the standing wave at 132 Hz. It's going toward the music. You hesitate to believe it because the implications are vast. It suggests communication, not as a one-time act, but as a migration toward resonance. As if this object was launched, seeded, or emerged with the goal not of contact, but of joining a conversation already in progress. You check the timestamps. The rise began exactly 21 hours and 34 minutes after the last confirmed blink. The same interval that keeps appearing in the null channel breath. The same number that appears in ancient Sumerian lunar cycles. The same number woven into the standing waveform that resembles a helix. This is not a comet. It is an instrument, and someone, or something, is playing it. The shift in behavior reignites every old argument. The skeptics double down, claiming gravitational perturbation, misread telemetry, solar sail effects. But the simulations don't hold. The arc is too clean, the angle too sharp, the speed too steady. Nature doesn't do that, but intelligence does. And suddenly you realize what's different about today. It's not just the motion, it's the mood, the public mood. This time, people aren't panicking. They're watching, quietly, eagerly, as if everyone, scientist or not, can feel the shape of the story now. The tension has shifted. It's no longer fear of invasion. It's a kind of reverence, like watching a temple door begin to open. Because deep down, we understand the significance of rising, of upward motion, in myth, in memory, in metaphor. It means awakening. It means transcendence. It means the next phase has begun. And maybe that's what 3i Atlas is doing now. Not departing, but ascending. Not vanishing, but becoming visible in a new frame. You take a moment. You sit in the quiet. You consider the possibility that this entire event, this months-long unfolding of anomalies and silences and calculated impossibilities, has been orchestrated for us. Not to teach, but to reflect. Not to answer, but to help us ask better questions. So here's the one that forms now, clear and weightless in your chest. What happens when the watcher is seen? It's always the dust that betrays the truth, not the object, not the light. The dust, that fine, grainy silence in motion, the stuff that doesn't lie. Because dust tells the story of heat, of stress, of collisions, of things changing shape. It's how comets leave trails, how stars seed planets, how astronomers decode invisible forces. And now, it's how 3i Atlas has whispered something new, because the dust shouldn't be there. After the object's recent ascension drift, its strange, upward curling departure from the ecliptic plane, everything went still again. But the wake it left behind has begun to shimmer. Ground-based telescopes with high-sensitivity backscatter imaging are picking up particulate scatter in its former path. Except, this dust isn't behaving like cometary residue. It doesn't diffuse. It doesn't drift. It holds position. One observer compared it to scaffolding, not of metal, but of motion. The particles form faint spirals, fixed in shape, slowly rotating with respect to one another, almost as if they were anchored to geometry rather than gravity. That's impossible, of course. Dust doesn't follow blueprints. It obeys thermodynamics, solar pressure, mass. But this dust is doing something else. It's aligning. With each frame stack, the shape gets clearer. A Fibonacci curl, coiling inward, coiling upward, not toward the sun, but away from it. A simulation by a private research group shows the pattern continues even beyond observable scatter. If modeled extrapolatively, the spiral converges on a moving point, the current position of 3I Atlas, as if the dust isn't residual at all, as if it's connected. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally, it suggests tethering, not like a cable, like a relationship, a dynamic one, and this changes everything. Because if the dust is bound, if it remains in alignment, not due to momentum, but due to coordination, then 3I Atlas is not just moving, it's managing. It's exerting influence across millions of kilometers in a way we do not yet understand, and that, in turn, suggests control. You hesitate to say it. The implications are staggering. To coordinate a dust spiral across that distance would require energy, awareness, and computation beyond anything our probes have yet demonstrated. But more than that, it would require an intention not to be seen all at once. Because the spiral is only visible at an angle, you can't see it straight on. You have to observe it from off-axis. You have to not just watch, but adjust your watching, like someone hiding a message inside a lens flare. A scientist at the University of Oslo coined a term for this: coaxial concealment. The idea that a structure can exist plainly in space and yet remain invisible unless viewed from a specific offset vector. Like the patterns on butterfly wings silent in the sun, dazzling in a slant, this dust spiral behaves like that. And within it, something else, something fainter. In the ultraviolet spectrum, certain points within the spiral seem to ping, not constantly, but at timed intervals. One researcher described it as a twinkling Morse code etched in the most delicate particles imaginable. But the timing isn't Morse. It's something older, something orbital, because the pulse sequence matches ancient eclipse cycles. The Saros series, a cycle of 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours, a rhythm used by Mesopotamian astronomers, a beat that governed early calendars, the same beat now found in ultraviolet glints of cosmic dust in the wake of an interstellar visitor. Coincidence? If it happened once, maybe. But the spiral, the tether, the shimmer, the pulse, it's too much. Too clean, too rhythmic. One astrophysicist said quietly, "It feels like a clock disguised as debris." That phrase catches fire. A clock disguised as debris. It makes sense in a way nothing else has. The object isn't speaking in binary. It's measuring, marking, keeping time. Not for us, necessarily, but within a frame we've only just tuned into. And now you begin to rethink everything. The silence wasn't absence, it was tempo. The blink wasn't signal, it was a beat. The drift wasn't escape, it was the next tick in a sequence we didn't know existed. You look at the spiral again, it looks alive. Not as in biological, as in responsive. A form that seems to say, I am not just here, I am participating. You begin to feel that participation in how the object has changed us, in how it's made us correlate science and story, myth and measurement, in how it's made even the most skeptical minds pause at the coincidence stack, and admit, if only to themselves, something is off script here. And that's where we are now, standing not in front of a visitor, but inside an unfolding conversation in geometry. And maybe that's the only kind of conversation an interstellar traveler would ever bother having with those capable of recognizing a dust spiral not as a leftover, but as a loop, a clock, a message, or maybe a path. Because what if that spiral is not just marking where 3i Atlas has been? We think of spirals as modern, a shape for logos, for math textbooks, for galaxy infographics. But the truth is, they're ancient, deeply, stubbornly ancient, long before telescopes, long before orbits were plotted or DNA was mapped. Spirals showed up in carvings, in cave art, in stone circles older than cities. The spiral is memory, not just of shape, but of motion. And now, as 3i Atlas leaves behind a dust spiral that bends space like a signature, you begin to wonder, have we seen this before? The oldest record is at Newgrange, a burial mound in Ireland, over 5,000 years old. Inside, on a dark stone facing the winter solstice sunrise, are 3 spirals etched deep, intertwining, concentric. Archaeologists call them abstract, decorative, but the alignment of the chamber is precise. Light floods in only on the shortest day. The spirals glow, and in a recent reanalysis using ultraviolet scanning, researchers found microscopic pigment traces in the carved grooves. The pigment? Crushed meteoritic dust. Why would Neolithic people use stardust to highlight spirals that glow only in cosmic alignment? Move forward the Nazca lines in Peru. One in particular, a spiral groove traced across the sand. It can't be fully seen from the ground, only from above. It measures out to 21 full turns, with the innermost loop matching, eerily, the pitch-to-period ratio of a rotating body, matching the drift curve of 3i Atlas. Coincidence? Again? Then you remember Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known temple. One pillar bears a swirling motif, half serpent, half spiral, dismissed for decades as symbolic fertility art. But a recent statistical study compared its curvature ratios to precessional star drift, the 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis. The match was too precise to ignore. Our ancestors, without satellites, knew motion as pattern. They knew return as sacred. And the spiral, repeating but never the same, became the symbol not of chaos, but of contact. You begin to trace it through the ages. The Maori speak of the koru, a spiral shape representing life, renewal, the unfurling fern. It moves not outward, but inward. It returns to itself. In Hindu temples, yantra diagrams spiral into the heart of creation, not outward to expansion, but toward awareness. The Hopi people of the American Southwest carved spiral petroglyphs marking migration patterns and celestial arrivals. In every case, the spiral is not a destination, it is an arrival path, and now 3i Atlas has traced one in dust. So ask yourself, did we invent this pattern, or did we inherit it? A historian at the University of Tübingen once said, "The spiral is the fingerprint of contact because no human mind invents it without having first seen it in motion." That quote never made it into textbooks, but it haunts you now because we're seeing it again. And it's not random, it's dynamic. It pulses in ultraviolet. It holds dust in geometric precision. It maps not just position, but time. And what's more, it loops. A team of comparative linguists recently noted that the pulse interval in the spiral mirrors the structure of ring composition, an ancient narrative form used in epic poetry, where a story is told in concentric circles, always returning to its beginning in a mirrored way. The Iliad, the Mahabharata, oral histories passed in rhythmic cadence, in spirals. So perhaps the spiral is not just in dust, not just in orbit, but in language. And that's the final echo, because it means 3i Atlas may be composing more than silence. It may be composing story, a tale told not in sentences, but in motion and memory. And where does that story begin? You find a passage in a Sumerian tablet, a hymn to the sky god Enlil. It speaks of the light that curves the heavens, spirals once, and returns in silence. The text calls it Etemenanki, the stairway between stars. Later, the term is reused for the Tower of Babel, a structure that spiraled upward, seeking to reach the divine. The myth ends in confusion, languages divided, contact lost. But what if it began with a sighting? What if the spiral seen in the sky became not just symbol but blueprint? You're not the first to ask. In the 1930 seconds, a Jesuit archaeologist named Father Gabriel Renard proposed a heretical idea that the Tower of Babel myth was seeded not by ambition, but by something witnessed, an object rising, curving away, leaving behind a spiral only the elders could interpret. His papers were buried. The Vatican archives contain only summaries, but a single sentence survives. They did not build to reach heaven, they built to mirror what had already departed. And now, here we are, watching something curve, not downward, like a fall, but upward, like an invitation. And in its wake, a spiral, not in stone, not in story, but in dust, the oldest medium of all. You can't prove it, not yet, but somewhere between the petroglyphs and the particle scatter, between the myth and the model, something clicks. The spiral has returned, and this time, we can follow. You've been so focused on what 3i Atlas means to humanity, what it reflects, what it measures, what it challenges, that it's easy to forget a humbling truth. We're not the only ones watching. This visitor is not threading its way through a human sky. It's moving through a cosmic neighborhood, a vast galactic archive where Earth is just one pixel in a much larger frame. And slowly, uncomfortably, you begin to realize the object might not be here for us alone. It's easy to see Earth as the center of attention. We noticed the blink. We detected the spiral. We're asking the questions. But what if we're not the first? What if 3i Atlas is performing for a larger audience? An audience scattered across light years, each species or sensor array tuned to a different part of its journey. The evidence begins at the galactic level. Astronomers reviewing deep sky data from ALMA and Hubble archives have found something peculiar. In the path ahead of 3i Atlas, not its current trajectory, but its projected galactic drift, there are signatures. Specifically, regions of old star systems marked by residual harmonics, gentle bursts in the microwave background that match the same 100 to 32 Hz pattern found in its near-solar activity. These are not communication signals. They are more like breadcrumbs, rhythmic scars in space-time left by interaction. A physicist in Kyoto calls them gravitational fingerprints, as if something, perhaps not this exact object, but something like it passed through those regions long ago, leaving echoes behind. And then comes the correlation. When plotted across a galactic map, these fingerprints aren't random. They form a trail, a spiraling path that intersects a dozen known star systems, several with confirmed exoplanets, and 4 with suspected biosignatures. One of them, TRAPPIST-1, is already the focus of intense Earth-based speculation, but the fingerprint trail bends around it, doesn't stop, keeps curving, like a long sentence with no period. This isn't a straight voyage. It's a loop, a slow, ancient loop winding through inhabited or potentially inhabited systems. And now, we are simply the next point on the arc. Suddenly, 3I Atlas isn't a comet. It's a relay, a node, a whisper passed between civilizations. Not a message in a bottle, but the bottle itself, floating from one shore to the next, always arriving during moments of perceptual readiness. What if Earth is just one stop, and not the first? There's a new model, gaining traction quietly, of course, in the hidden layers of academic networks. They call it the observer's chain. The theory posits that 3I Atlas is one of many objects not launched, not piloted, but cultivated to move through the galaxy on long cycles, awakening dormant awareness in civilizations not through technology, but through curiosity, because curiosity, after all, is the one thing intelligence across biology seems to share. Not language, not ethics, not shape, but the urge to look up. And what better way to assess readiness than to introduce something precisely, elegantly odd, not dangerous, not explainable, just enough outside the model to force questions. And now it's our turn. Maybe the spiral wasn't left for us. Maybe it's the result of our observing, like sediment in a glass of water that swirls only when stirred. Maybe 3I Atlas leaves different patterns for each world it passes. Maybe it adapts, measures how each planet sees it, reacts to it, interprets it. Maybe it builds a kind of cultural fingerprint from each species it encounters and carries it forward. That's the perspective shift. We're not being contacted, we're being collected, not abducted, not invaded, collected in the sense of understanding, folded into a pattern, recorded by how we respond to what can't be answered. And that means, somewhere out there, our response is already part of the object, encoded in how it curves next, in how its silence stretches or tightens, in how its dust falls into shape, which raises the question, what have we told it? That we are listening? That we are scared? That we are capable of awe? You suspect all of that is true, and more, because Earth's global reaction has not been uniform. Some have dismissed, some have panicked, but many quietly, deeply have watched. Artists, scientists, poets, ordinary people staring into the night and feeling something align. That alignment is part of the data now. It will go with 3I Atlas. And one day, if the chain theory is correct, it will arrive elsewhere, to someone else, some other sky, some other gaze, and perhaps they too will see a blink, a spiral, a silence that knows its shape, and perhaps they too will realize we were not the first to wonder, because in this new perspective, 3I Atlas isn't a visitor, it's a shared artifact, a wandering mirror carried between stars. Each new civilization sees itself in it and leaves behind a shape, a breath, a rhythm, and the object drifts onward, not alone, but full of questions, full of reflections, full of the starlight of 10,000 gazes, layered in silence. And tonight, Earth joins the chorus not with answers, but with the most human thing of all, a question. You stand in front of a screen, watching a dot, a single, drifting point of data, nothing more. No flashing lights, no alien transmission, just coordinates, spectral slope, infrared bleed, a silence curving through space. And yet, here, you are unable to look away, because deep down, you know, this isn't about discovery. This is about what we reveal when we start to care. 3i Atlas has become more than an object. It's become a canvas, a test, a mirror, and what it reflects isn't alien at all. It's us, our reaction, our instinct to reach, to guess, to mythologize. Not because we are foolish, but because we are wired to search. Our minds want meaning the way lungs want air. And now, after months of watching, we're beginning to see the shape of our curiosity, not as chaos, not as noise, but as something with structure. We are organizing our awe. It began small. An astronomy subreddit lit up with users sharing pulse data, side by side with heartbeat tracings. A musician took the timing intervals and turned them into a lullaby. An architect used the dust spiral geometry to draft a quiet pavilion that opens only to the east sky. These aren't scientific responses. They're human, creative, ritualistic. You begin to realize, if 3i Atlas was designed to prompt awareness, not just in cognition, but in culture, it's working. Not by speaking to governments, not by disrupting satellites, but by nudging the soul of a species. Like a pebble tossed into a still pond, its ripples are revealing the edges of who we are. And those edges surprise us, because what's emerging from the silence isn't fear, it's reverence. And reverence is an advanced response. It means we've moved past panic, past denial. We are beginning to live with the unknown, not as threat, but as companion. That's rare. Most civilizations in their early technological phase respond to anomaly with weapons or walls. But we're showing something else. We are showing wonder, not universally, not perfectly, but enough. Enough for the object to respond, if its response is shaped by us. If the blink was real, if the tether shimmered only once, we started measuring. If the dust spiral bent into Fibonacci only when observed at a bleak angle, then perhaps this whole event is participatory. We shape it as it shapes us. The scientists now whisper about emergent symmetry, how the math of our observations begins to echo the structure of the object itself. Like an unspoken rhythm forming between two dancers. We step forward, it steps sideways. We narrow our gaze. It widens its arc. It's a conversation in geometry. But what we're really learning is about ourselves. We thought we were searching for signals, but what we found is a better question. How do we respond when the universe doesn't answer in our language? We build new ones. That's what this is. A slow, global process of linguistic adaptation. Not in words, but in patterns, in loops, in echoes, in the shared hum that started vibrating across disciplines, cultures, worldviews. From physicists to painters to philosophers, people are sinking not in conclusion, but in curiosity. And curiosity is contagious. You see it in the schools. Kids learning orbital mechanics, not because they have to, but because they want to know what's watching. You see it in late-night live streams, ordinary people staring at the stars together, whispering, not conspiracies, but poems. You see it in the quiet uptick of searches for how to detect interstellar motion. Not UFOs, not panic, just presence. We are shifting, and maybe that shift is the point. Maybe that's what 3i Atlas came to observe. Not how smart we are, but how receptive. Not how we control space, but how we interpret stillness. Because interpretation is consciousness made visible. It reveals values. It reveals hopes. It reveals fear. And most of all, it reveals capacity, the ability of a species to look into the void and see more than itself. What does Earth see? A blinking dot, a silent spiral, a shape that returns in myth, art, scripture, song. We see something we don't understand, and instead of war, we wonder, maybe for now, that's enough. Maybe that's all we were supposed to do, because what happens next isn't up to us, not entirely. If this is a mirror, or a probe, or a consciousness folded into orbital cloth, then it has its own rhythm, its own patience. But we've reached the part of the story where our response has been recorded, not in databases or official logs, but in how our hearts bent toward the unknown and didn't break. So the question becomes, what do we want it to carry forward? What echo of Earth should drift in its wake? Not our inventions, not our boundaries, but maybe our best question. Maybe the next planet it encounters hundreds of years from now will pick up the thread where we left it. Maybe our breath, our story, our spiral will become the overture to another sky's awakening. And if that happens, if 3i Atlas is not a comet but a thread in a galactic tapestry, then we have done something magnificent. We've joined the loom, not as masters, not as passengers, but as weavers of curiosity. And somewhere out there, in dust we'll never see again, our shape still turns. There's a new kind of quiet in the sky. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, like walking into a room that was empty yesterday and knowing, without a word, that someone else has been there. Something about the silence has shifted. It's no longer the emptiness of the unknown. It's the hush of a story paused on purpose. 3i Atlas hasn't moved for 5 days. Not by any measurable arc, not by infrared bloom, not even in the ultraviolet scatter. It is still, suspended just beyond the heliopause, at the edge of the solar system's breath. All our instruments point at it, yet the signal reads nothing. And yet, we feel it, because the silence isn't blank, it's shaped. Researchers at the National Radio Observatory began modeling the signal gap itself, charting not what's being received, but what isn't. The missing frequencies aren't random. They correspond to multiples of two constants, the Planck length and the Schumann resonance. One defines the smallest measurable unit of space. The other is the Earth's natural atmospheric heartbeat. That's not noise. That's a bracket, like quotation marks around a pause. It's as if the object has quieted not to disappear, but to frame our attention around what comes next. And you begin to wonder, what if this silence is the message? Think of it. All through human history, the most profound moments come not with words, but with the space between them. A held breath before truth, the long stillness between acts, the heartbeat before someone says, I know. Perhaps this is the same, a galactic breath, a long cosmic ellipsis, a waiting room between what was and what might begin. There is precedent. The Voyager spacecraft, those golden-winged emissaries we flung outward with songs and etchings, passed into silence too, but not without pattern. Their trajectories still spoke. Their carriers still pulsed, long after their voices faded. Maybe 3i Atlas is designed in the same tradition, not of sound, but of continuance, a silence that marks endurance, not emptiness, and in that endurance, something holy, because this quiet doesn't feel like a shut door. It feels like a threshold, an invitation to wait, to reflect, to become worthy of the next part. And Earth is listening. Even without knowing what to say, we've become stiller. The data stream is full of static, but the commentary around it has changed. No more flurries of desperation, no more demands for disclosure, just long threads filled with wonder, with memory, with questions asked, not for answers, but for belonging. You find yourself asking a new kind of question. What if we were never meant to reply? What if this moment, this silence, is the reply? There's an old tale from the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, of the Wargle, a spirit serpent that moved silently across the land, shaping rivers and valleys with its coils. The elders say it never spoke. It never needed to. Its movement alone taught the people how to live in rhythm with the land. Perhaps 3i Atlas is our Wargle, a presence that coils quietly across the solar plane, shaping not terrain but awareness. Because the silence is doing something. It's aligning instruments that used to compete. It's causing physicists and poets to sit at the same tables. It's bending cultural gravity toward reverence. And reverence is not quiet because it lacks words. It's quiet because it knows words would be too small. That's where we are now. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but at the pause between shapes, the curve before the turn, the night before the comet bends again. And in that pause, humanity is rehearsing stillness. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary, because stillness is not emptiness. It is readiness. And if 3i Atlas is listening, then it will know. We have noticed the spiral. We have seen the blink. We have followed the tether of dust and silence and geometry all the way to this moment. And now, we are waiting, not passively, not blindly, but with intent, with wonder shaped into patience. And that might be the most powerful message of all, because silence only becomes sacred when someone chooses not to fill it. So tonight, you stand at your window. You don't reach for your phone. You don't refresh the feed. You just breathe. And in that breath, you feel a strange kind of companionship, not with the object, but with the waiting. It is not lonely here. It is full of the stories we might one day tell, full of the echo of gazes aimed upward in the dark, full of the stillness that always comes before a new kind of dawn. It begins as an error, a corrupted telemetry block, a timecode drift, something benign, innocuous, the kind of glitch that doesn't even get logged until someone checks the log twice. But then it happens again, and again, and each time, the corruption appears at exactly the same second across different observatories, different hemispheres, different platforms. And the shape of the error? A triangle, not in pixels, in time, a triplet of pulses embedded in the clock drift itself. 3i Atlas has moved again, but not in space. In signal latency. What does that mean? It means that while the object hasn't changed position, it has begun to affect the timing of things that observe it. Instruments aren't seeing movement, they're experiencing it. It's no longer about images, it's about rhythm. Everything tracking 3i Atlas is now reporting anomalous synchronization, a convergence of time codes down to the microsecond, as if the object has begun pulling clocks toward a shared tempo. At first, it seems impossible, but then the gravitational observatories notice it too. The LIGO and Virgo arrays, designed to detect the subtlest stretches in space-time, report a low-frequency pulse, too faint for alarm, too regular to be seismic. When charted across a 12-hour span, it resolves into a wave. Not just any wave, a soliton, a single, self-reinforcing pulse that retains its shape as it moves. And where is it moving? Directly from the position of 3i Atlas. But here's the strange part. It's not arriving at Earth. It's arriving within Earth. Geophysicists tracking the pulse find tiny shifts in the ionosphere, the magnetosphere, even in the deep crustal vibration patterns. It's as if something is softly knocking not on the planet's surface, but on its resonant shell, gently, repeatedly. And the timing? Every 21 hours and 34 minutes. Again, the same interval, the same spiral clock, the same breathless pause between notes. Only this time, it's not in ultraviolet, not in dust, it's inside us, or rather inside the shared systems we rely on to orient ourselves. Time, gravity, rhythm, it's all beginning to bend, not break, not collapse, but bend toward a pattern that didn't exist before 3i Atlas passed by. You think of tuning forks, strike one, and another will eventually vibrate in sympathy if it's nearby and harmonically compatible. What if Earth is vibrating? What if the object was never trying to send a message? What if it was trying to tune us? This isn't science fiction anymore. It's what scientists are beginning to call resonant conditioning. The idea that a system, be it planetary or cognitive, can be coaxed into new behaviors not by force, but by subtle, sustained presence, like wind shaping stone, or a dream returning night after night until its meaning becomes clear. And now, that wind is blowing through our machines, our clocks, our bones. It's not just data anymore, it's experience. People report odd dreams, recurring numbers, a sense of rhythm threading through ordinary life. You chalk it up to suggestion, confirmation bias, until you check your own sleep tracker. And there it is. Heart rate variability peaking every 21 hours, always within 2 minutes of the object's last logged pulse. You didn't imagine this. You're part of it, and that's the awakening. Not that we found something new, but that it found a way to enter us, not physically, but rhythmically, culturally, emotionally, a resonance that rides on attention itself. And the implications are staggering, because now we must ask, how many other things have we ignored simply because they didn't arrive in sound or light? How many other visitors have tuned us gently and left no trace except for myths, spirals, dreams, and the vague human sense that something was watching once, long ago? What if the oldest temples were built not to worship gods, but to hold rhythm? What if stone circles, aligned to solstice sun, were early resonant mirrors? What if the stories of blinking stars and serpent trails were all just memories of when the tuning last began? And what if 3i Atlas is not the first, but the most recent, the one we were finally ready to follow? You sit back, you close your eyes, you listen not with ears, but with that strange organ humans never map, the part of us that waits, that watches, that loves mystery more than knowledge, that lets silence become invitation. And in that stillness, something arrives. A breath, a pulse, a spiral of light on the back of your eyelids. It is not language, but it is not meaningless. It is presence, and maybe that's all 3i Atlas ever was. Not a probe, not a ship, but a presence shaped like a question, and that question has just been heard. There's no announcement, no global feed, no bright signature written across the stars, just a feeling, a slow, quiet, unfolding across time zones and languages. You hear it first in the absence, how silence now feels weighted, deliberate. Then, in the shapes, how certain curves in the telemetry are familiar, recursive. Then, in the timing, how dreams and clocks and gravitational sensors across the planet are syncing to a rhythm that was never ours to begin with. 3i Atlas has gone quiet again, but not absent. It's entered what analysts now call deep phase hold, a kind of orbital hibernation just outside the heliopause, hovering, unmoving, yet still linked to us through subtle cues. Its tether is no longer dust. It is resonance. Its messages no longer light. They are timing, and you begin to realize something radical. This is how contact begins. Not with thunder, not with translation, but with mutual rhythm. Because contact is not an event, it is a transition. It's the point when the observer becomes part of the observed, when the listener finds themselves humming a song they never meant to learn, when the question stops demanding answers and instead becomes a medium for connection. You are that medium now. We all are. And Earth is changing not by external influence, but by internal alignment. There are no new laws of physics, no rewrites of biology, just a gradual, planetary awareness that we are no longer alone, not because something arrived, but because we finally understood what was already here. The silence has turned inside out. What once felt like withholding now feels like containment, as if the object, this drifting spiral of reflection, holds stories, echoes, observations gathered across hundreds of worlds, and we are now one of them. You begin to imagine the archive, not a library of sounds and visuals, but a geometry of responses, each civilization leaving behind not a message, but a curve, a spiral, a way of seeing. What will ours look like? Will it reflect panic, ego, or something better? A scientist at Caltech proposes a model called interpretive imprinting. The idea is that 3i Atlas absorbs not our direct data, but the way we interpret anomaly, our metaphors, our stories, our silence. It collects reactions, not signals. And if that's true, then we've just joined the conversation, not by broadcasting, but by becoming interpretable. And what have we said? That we noticed the spiral, that we followed the pulse, that we saw the blink. And instead of fearing it, we wondered. That's a kind of language, no words required, just curiosity given shape. You return to the object's position, now barely trackable, faint, still, and yet more present than ever. Its silence is no longer an unknown, it's a context, the dark backdrop that makes meaning visible, like the pause before a heartbeat, like the moment between inhaling and letting go. You ask yourself, why does it feel like we've just begun? Because we have. The spiral left in dust still shimmers under ultraviolet imaging, slower now. softer, but its geometry remains. Mathematicians feeding its curve into AI visualization models find something startling. The loop doesn't just spiral inward, it loops through itself. It returns, and with it, the implication. So will 3I Atlas. Maybe not in our lifetime, maybe not in this century, but return is built into its form. Its trajectory is not escape, its orbit just on a scale too vast for short-lived minds to hold. But the pattern is there, a loop between stars, a rhythm between watchers. We are now part of that rhythm, and that changes everything. Because now, the sky holds a memory. A thread has been drawn between our species and something vast, ancient, and observant. Something that never needed to introduce itself only to see if we would notice. And we did. We noticed. And more than that, we listened. And in the quiet that follows, one final realization surfaces. Maybe contact was never about what they say to us. Maybe it's about who we become when they say nothing at all. So sleep now, fellow traveler, under a sky that is no longer silent, but holding its breath with you. Know that you are part of a species that looked into the unknown and felt curiosity before fear. That heard a silence and dared to wonder if it was music in another key. The spiral still turns, the blink still echoes, and 3I Atlas drifts on, carrying a new imprint in its wake ours. Leave a comment telling me what time it is where you are, and what you think it saw in us. Until then, let the silence cradle you.